So the story, which we heard a version of just now, actually shows up in 3 different forms in the Gospels, and it's told slightly different each time with a little bit of an emphasis. So we're going to read the account from the Gospel of Luke today, which comes from Luke chapter 9. And we're going to read starting with verse 28 all the way through verse 36. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. But while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of any of the things they had seen. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. In case anyone was noticing, yes, I do have a backup cup of coffee that's under the pulpit. I ran out of coffee a few minutes ago during the children's moment, and I was really glad that I had forgotten my backup cup, as it will now affectionately be known. I think I'm going to do that every week now. It's pretty good. I like that. This morning we're talking about transformation. We're talking about change. We're on the cusp of a changing season in the church calendar, so it's on our minds. We're thinking about ways in which we might change. Lent is an invitation in some ways to examine our own lives and think about changes that are positive, maybe changes that are difficult but are necessary. So it makes sense that we are right on the cusp of Lent this morning with a story that's all about change, but it's not the typical adjusting to a new life kind of story. In fact, if anything, it's a little psychedelic. There's something about this experience that if your friend were to tell you they had this experience with a buddy of theirs, you might ask, "Did you eat any mushrooms while you were up on that mountain with Jesus? Anything just lying around that you picked up off the ground that looked appetizing that maybe you're regretting after a couple hours and it starts to kick in?" Especially as you're passing through that cloud, as the scripture says. And Moses and Elijah show up at one point, and somehow, even though there isn't Facebook or the internet, Peter and James and John recognize the faces of Moses and Elijah right away. They know who they are, and they're so in awe of their experience that they say what? They say, "Let's build tents and essentially stay here and just soak it in as long as we can." And the scripture says Peter says this not knowing what he said. So obviously there's something wrong with Peter's mentality that being up here is okay. We'll get to that. Right now, let's just kind of be in this story for a minute and kind of parse out what's actually happening. The Transfiguration is one of a handful of moments in the story of Christ that are pretty much universally considered pivotal regardless of what your particular denominational or theological background happens to be. So you might be Catholic, you might be Orthodox, you might be Protestant, you might be non-denominational, but the Transfiguration contains, at least according to Christian tradition, some mystery, some key that explains not just something about Jesus, but what it means to follow Jesus. At least that's the theory. So what's happening? What is Jesus doing when he transfigures? In the Christian tradition, the word specifically refers to this act of Jesus's and also to this thing that we're supposed to do mimicking Jesus. Jesus is transformed. His light, his glory is truly, fully revealed, and the disciples are in awe of that. It's a really beautiful thing. And somehow, this idea generates through 2,000 years of Christian tradition that there's something about what Jesus is doing that you and I can kind of do and duplicate. The scripture tells us that when he was transfigured, what happened? Well, he was revealed in all his glory. The word glory is ambiguous, it's squishy. It has a historical connotation, at least within the Christian church. It doesn't just mean awesomeness. It's not just an occasion for wonder. It's actually almost a substance in Christian tradition. It's like the stuff God is made of. So if you witness God's glory, then you're somehow pulling the veil away so that you're really seeing at least an aspect of God for what it is. And that's what the disciples experience when they experience Jesus' glory in the transfiguration. Something about Jesus that had made it possible for him to seem like an ordinary Joe Schmo is pulled away on this mountain, and the disciples become so enamored with it that they just want to stay there and essentially live in it. So that's what transfiguration is, at least in technical parlance. And then there's this idea that we're supposed to mimic it. The epistle of Peter actually talks about this, glory of God being revealed, and the idea that it inspires something in our hearts, a change. So it's not just a really cool experience that you can brag about to your friends. It's something is happening to you that makes what you do in the world better, fuller, brings shalom, wholeness, back to pieces, maybe of you or maybe of the world around you that were previously broken. That's transfiguration. And it's a lifelong process. It doesn't happen like it did with Jesus, where the veil is totally ripped away in an instant, like flipping a switch, and we suddenly realize our inner divine nature. It doesn't happen like that. Enlightenment, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, nirvana, bliss, union with God, whatever you want to call it. For us, it doesn't happen like that. We work at it for many, many years, and sometimes it's just the little things. Connie, this is really terrible. I'm sorry. I think this should embarrass me more than embarrass you, but I'm going to use this as an example. I was having coffee in the kitchen earlier, and Connie walks up to me and says, "Your barn door is open." It's like, what are you talking about? It's all family. It's all good. I was like, I don't know what you're talking. Oh, okay, yes. Sometimes it's just finding the discreet way to say the nice thing. And in the back of my mind, you walked away, and I just wanted to tell you, I was like, well, that was so nice of her to do that. It's such a, not to embarrass me in front of everybody. That was so great. So I figured I would just embarrass myself. Sometimes becoming a little more transfigured, a little more in the image of Christ, happens in these little things, those small gestures, just thinking to do something. I had a therapist who told me once I was in a particularly bad place, and I was beating up on myself, and one of the most helpful things this therapist ever said to me was, the fact that you recognize that there's something you can do, and you've done at least a little something, is something worth acknowledging. It's something worth celebrating. You made an effort. Sometimes it's just getting out of the bed, getting up in the morning, taking a shower, putting clothes on, and feeling like a human being. Sometimes it's doing a job or a calling. It's a career. Sometimes it's a role that you fall into unofficially. Maybe you start volunteering somewhere, and before you know it, you've spent years of your life, maybe decades of your life, serving in a particular target area. So not only were you, over the course of those years, transfigured, you transfigured the world around you a little bit, at least in theory. But it wouldn't be a sermon, at least a sermon for me, if I didn't do some kind of play on words thing. So let's look at this transfigured and transfixed. This idea that change is an inherent part of faith isn't new. We've talked about this many times. But this idea of having the right response for the wrong reasons, or the wrong response for the right reasons, as in the case of Peter, James, and John, and wanting to essentially enshrine their experience so that it can't change. The only thing that came to mind, and there are many examples, but the only thing that was in my mind this week was the United Methodist Church's vote not to be LGBT inclusive. If you were paying attention, this was a few years coming. This was something that they had been debating for a number of years, and there was a plan on the books called the One Church Plan that was designed to essentially lay out a live and let live policy. That's the best way to describe it. It would allow clergy and congregations that are not what we call open and affirming, LGBT inclusive. It would allow those congregations, what's called reconciling ministries in the United Methodist Church. It would allow those churches to exist, and for those ministers to be inclusive and to practice their faith as an inclusive faith. And it would allow ministers who are not inclusive and congregations that are not fully inclusive of the entire church to continue to be entrenched in those positions. They would just have to say honestly where they stood on the issue and acknowledge that it isn't a position held in the entire church, and maybe accept that someone might go by choice to another church that's a little more inclusive. Instead of voting for or against this plan, they took it a step further. Not only did they vote against the plan, they voted to adopt an even more conservative plan that a lot of folks didn't think had a chance of passing. So, as it was, there was kind of a look the other way approach to acts of inclusion in the church, same-sex weddings, that kind of thing. But now, under this new plan, the United Methodist Church makes it possible to actually strip credentials or pull standing from entire congregations, even for using the logo after all those years. Now, this is a messy issue because it would be really, really easy without looking at the numbers to say, those darn Methodists, they had the chance and they blew it. But when you actually look at the numbers, the American Methodist Church, which is the large chunk of the church that we kind of experience as United Methodism, it's the third largest religious institution in the United States. It's the public face of Methodism as we experience it in the Western world. But they were, for the most part, fairly inclusive. The vote was really encouraging. I think had the American church been exclusively voting for themselves, it probably would have gone a very different way. This is where things get really messy. Because it's really good that the American church has finally decided to become inclusive. But it's our brothers and sisters in churches in other parts of the world to whom we actually exported our homophobia for many, many years, and now those chickens are coming home to roost. So it's not so much a matter of the American church hasn't gotten its act together, but we have a legacy. You can't just blame it all on, I don't know, the African church, whatever that means. That gets you into super dodgy territory, by the way, and I did see a little bit of that this week. This is our legacy. The church, American Protestants for many, many years ran homophobic institutions, and in many cases still do. And so we're dealing with the repercussions of that missions work in other parts of the world. And as the church grows there and gets smaller here, the balance of power shifts. But the argument, and this was the thing that bothered me so much about this is the only reason I bring it up today. The argument that I heard all last week when trying to find some balance on both sides, good people on both sides kind of thing, was that ultimately the reason why there were good people on both sides is because tradition. So yes, we have this group of people over here who are arguing for inclusion and dignity and just to be, people. and just equals. But we have this other group of people over here, and they're really attached to tradition. They deserve a little credit for that, right? What I love about this passage is that by implication, Jesus is saying no. Because we can become so fixed on this thing, this maybe way of doing things, this status quo, the context around us that feels particularly triumphant for us or has treated us well. And we can become so attached to that, and maybe God was initially in it, but in our attachment, we drain it of all its life. And then our kids just leave. And I say our kids, my people leave. Queer Christians like me just give up. Because for so long they were told, you don't belong. This isn't a sermon about inclusion. But I say it because I think it's important for us to recognize that traditions and how we do things, how we comport ourselves, how we go about the work of connecting and pointing others to connecting to God actually has real-life consequences. And things like tradition and how we've always done things and things that have worked in the past can be beautiful sources of inspiration and strength, or they can be shackles. The thing about the Transfiguration is that it doesn't end. The story didn't end with that revelation. We don't know exactly when Jesus chose to pull the veil back over his face, to return to normal. But at some point, almost like coming down from a drug trip, the disciples suddenly wake up and Moses and Elijah are gone and it's just Jesus. And then they go on about the work they were doing. They didn't stay up on the mountain. We all have those mountains. Maybe as a community, maybe as an individual. Those things to which we have become so attached, maybe it's a way of doing things, a way of seeing the world. Maybe it's a spiritual experience we've had, or just an idea that works so well for us that we're afraid to let it go, or afraid to see it be transfigured into something new and even possibly better. It touches all of us. And so my invitation to you this week is allow yourself to be transformed. Change is scary. Not changing is scarier. Just doesn't seem that way necessarily in the short term. And hopefully, friends, and I know it was a really rough week, I got to be honest with you. I wasn't totally surprised by the Methodist vote, but I was disappointed. And as a person who really would hope that as churches we would just move on and just be inclusive and be done with it, it was a hard week. So my invitation to you, to me, to all of us, to the Methodist Church, to any congregation that's still so attached to one way of doing things that it can't see past the nose on its face, my invitation is this. Let's get off the mountain. And when we climb down, let's be thankful for the experience we had while we were up there. But folks, the story didn't end. Let's climb down.